Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance and convener of the Transform Finance Investor Network. I'm glad to have you join us for this webinar and presentation on open book management as a transformative business practice. We'll be looking with Anne Claire Broughton of Broughton Consulting and Tom Strong of Open Book People and previously of the Hitachi Foundation, where he worked on quality jobs. Anne Claire was previously at the SJF Institute. They will help us look through how open book management can be relevant to an agenda of transformation and the role that investors can play in that. Now, how is it relevant to our work? The more I've learned about open book management through Tom and Anne Claire, the more I've realized that there's an intersection of several areas of inquiry at the same time here that we've been following with Investor Network over the last year and a half or so. One is this issue of engagement generally, whether it's broadly as a community or as workers, and accountability to that group. And specifically in the employment context, the issue of worker voice and how that is diminishing in the context of the changes in labor dynamics, work moving from traditional employment with labor representation to gig economy with no representation. And it seems like open book management gets a little bit at all these issues, right? Making work more higher engagement, really taking workers seriously as an integral part of an organization and not just as a cost to be reduced or outsourced or as liability. The piece around accountability because of the openness of and the back and forth flow of the information in the case of open book management. It also ties into the issue of quality jobs. As you might remember from our early work, one of the pillars of quality jobs was really this sense of meaning that one can derive from it, and through that, the opportunities for advancement that can come with it, but really feeling like you are integral part of the organization, you're part of the decision-making, and upskilling yourself within the organization, as we'll see in the case of Zingermans that does internal promotion, internal hiring, even across the constellation of companies that have come out of the original Zingermans. Lastly, opportunities for asset building. We often talk about the fact that even at income parity, the wealth gap is still growing, in particular for communities of color. So if there is extra value that is both being created through open book management and that is fairly allocated to the workers and doesn't just go to the original owners, that is definitely a positive development to look into. And more broadly in that context, the nexus between open book management and employee ownership more broadly. So you can think of open book management as a precursor to employee ownership, right? A way of creating that culture of ownership that we always say is so fundamental for a successful transition, in particular to employee ownership. And that's something that we're exploring now in our work with Open Society Foundations around what a capital vehicle would look like to foster more of the convergence to employee ownership. But also once you have this employee ownership, how can open book management be used to really empower the workers and make them feel like they are a fundamental part of that conversation. A couple of things to keep in mind as we think about this from the investor perspective is, what is the investment thesis around this? And what are some of the pitfalls that might come with that? Again, going back to the quality jobs work, you might recall some of the data was pretty good. It was not an airtight investment thesis, but as investors concerned with the impact on more stakeholders than just the owners of the companies, the very existence of an investment thesis and some solid evidence of the benefits both to the company and to the workers should be considered. And the last piece is around the investment structure. So we have looked at alternatives to the closed-end fund as being non-suitable for a lot of enterprises. And we'll see in the example of Zingerman that will come up how open book management maps well onto a holding company strategy where you can have this umbrella organization that has a stake in several of its subsidiaries, or is even 100% owner of those subsidiaries. So those are a couple of the angles that we want to explore now with Tom and Anne Claire. And I just want to put out there one of the questions that had come up originally in a conversation with CalPERS, you might remember almost a couple of years ago, which is, as these jobs improve either through a job quality strategy or through open book management, is there any social justice and racial justice angle that we should be concerned about? And in that case, we're looking at some early evidence of the fact that as some jobs improve, they tend to accrue to already privileged, generally white and educated workers, and taken away from communities of color in particular. So not using that as an indictment of this, but really just as something that, as we push for better and deeper practices across all stakeholders, we just want to be aware of. And with that, I will turn it over to Anne Claire Broughton and to Tom Strong for their presentation. Tom, Anne Claire, I've learned already so much from you. I look forward to hearing you on this webinar. Thank you so much for joining our group.
And in other countries and other developed countries in the world. And even in developing countries, this pattern holds. In more recent years, more and more of the gains from GDP growth have gone to the very rich. And we all know why that's happening. There's been a decrease in the valuation of labor. Labor literally earns less on the dollar than it used to out of economic growth. And more of the gains from growth have been going to capital and capital ownership, including profits off of ownership in companies. So a lot of smart people have been looking at this problem, trying to figure out why labor has been losing value at the expense of capital and what can be done about it. And of course, many of the solutions that are looked at are policy level solutions. So there are also a lot of people looking at how businesses and enterprises can actually start to address this and what difference investors can make. And so one of the big tools in our toolkit there is employee ownership. And there's a hope out there that employee ownership can come to the rescue. Organizations like NCEO, the National Center for Employee Ownership, the Democracy Collaborative, the new concept of platform co-op, all of them are looking at different ways to invest in and spread knowledge of employee ownership as a tool. The great thing about employee ownership is that decades of research now show that it makes it, that basically the larger trends in our economy don't apply to it so much, that workers in employee-owned companies do considerably better than their peers in non-employee-owned companies. But the companies themselves also, at the very least, are not harmed by employee ownership, and in many cases may benefit from it greatly. And so this sounds like a win-win, right? How can this not be a good deal? And it is a good deal, but the thing is that it's an incomplete picture. In and of itself, employee ownership is not quite enough. The problem that you run into is that even when you give people equity, it doesn't change the management model and doesn't change their concept of ownership. We all know people, we probably are people who have owned stock in companies that we feel no connection to. We may be stockholders, but we're not true owners. And at the same time, in important ways, although stockholders are kind of the great benefactors of the economy in our times, when it comes down to the individual enterprise level, they are often at a disadvantage compared to upper management. And this image, which if you've been to business school, you've probably seen in some form, explains that relationship. Basically, principals, owners, struggle sometimes with regard to management because upper management has more information about how the enterprise works than they have. And so there's all kinds of ways that management can use that information to its advantage when it comes to performance. If you take employee owners as a group and put them into the principals section of this chart, it doesn't necessarily change their relationship to management. And it doesn't change the way that they're able to participate in the management of the company. So what you need is a more participatory system. And this is a consistent finding in employee ownership literature, is that the most successful organizations that are employee owned have both dramatic increase in stock ownership by employees, but they also have some kind of participatory management system. And different studies have looked at this from different angles. But the end point is that if you don't change the operating system, the way in which the company is managed in the first place, then the benefits of employee ownership are much harder to receive. Anne Claire and I have both come to this work with the understanding that there are systems out there for improving how we manage companies that can make a difference both in employee-owned companies and even in those that are not yet employee-owned. And the one that we're both trained in and we're excited to talk about today is open book management. So with that, Anne Claire's going to tell you about how open book management works.
Great. So open book management is a way to engage employees and workers at every level to really understand how the business works. So they understand how the business makes money, how much it costs to produce the product or service, and what the major expenses are. And it demystifies the financial statements. It shares that information with everybody. It teaches everyone how to understand the statements and to connect the stories behind the numbers, because every number is about somebody doing something in a business. And it's about getting everybody at every level actively engaged in setting the targets, connecting what they do every day with those targets, holding each other accountable, and then sharing in the gains as the business does better. So ownership culture is a term that we use to describe a fully engaged culture where people really have agency. They are thinking, they are feeling, they're acting like owners. They're making better day-to-day decisions. So every organization has a culture, whether or not we're aware of it. Culture is sort of the shared story that people tell each other at work. It's how you feel when you walk into an organization. I saw this many, many times at SJF. You would walk into some businesses and feel energized, and you would see that everybody was engaged. And in other businesses, people were constrained, and the energy was very low. So some founders are very intentional about creating the type of culture they want, a lot of participation. A lot of people don't even think about culture, but there always is a culture, and it's pretty much based on the founders' personalities and values. There are lots of different ways to create participatory culture, but open book management is one of the best that I've found. So how does it work? I'm going to give you some details here to try to paint a picture of what it is, and then I'm going to give you some examples from businesses. So these are the three principles of open book management: know and teach the rules, follow the action and keep score, and provide a stake in the outcome. And as you can see, they're all organized around a critical number. That is something that changes every year, and it's a key weakness or vulnerability that has to be addressed for the business to be strong. It provides this big picture goal that pulls everybody together and gives them focus. A lot of times in the first couple of years, it's around margin, but that may change to a different number in future years. It may even become something operational. Now, these are the 9 practices, and I'm going to give you some detail, but it's important to keep this detail in mind. So know and teach the rules. That's pretty clear. It's about financial education. People need to know what is a profit and loss statement, what is a balance sheet, what is a cash flow statement. They have to be able to read them and understand them. And then people as a group doing a SWOT analysis to set that critical number and doing high involvement planning at the beginning of every year so people are clear on the engagement of the business and they're engaged in setting that. Follow the action and keep score is about creating scoreboards that are easy to understand. Some are pretty much financial statements and some are more creative. We're going to show you some examples, and keeping those updated on a weekly basis. and it's about creating this weekly rhythm of meetings that we call huddles to check in on the big picture, to make sure everybody knows what they've got to do to stay on track, and then to forecast the numbers. So remember that word forecast. We're going to talk more about it in a minute. The way that open book management gets people engaged is to assign line item ownership. So imagine a truncated P&L with just the most important line items that people can control. And people at all levels will be in charge of one of those revenue or expense items. They're going to learn all about what goes into it, study how it performed historically, and then find ways to influence it going forward. One story I like to tell is about an hourly worker at a catering company called Tasty Catering. He was put in charge of fuel costs, and of his own accord, he figured out that fuel prices were cheaper from Sunday to Wednesday, and so they always fuel up at the beginning of the week. And then he started turning off trucks that idled for more than 10 minutes. So he was able to come to that weekly huddle and show savings of hundreds of dollars, which goes into everybody's bonus plan. And then he was able to forecast how the company would end the month on fuel costs because he was following it week to week. Again, we'll talk more about that, but that brings us to the stake in the outcome. So that's about the annual bonus plan, which is very clearly defined at the beginning of the year, and it's based on hitting the critical number. So everyone knows exactly where the bonus plan stands all year. It's very different than most companies where management sort of sees how you end the year, there's a pot of money, they give out bonuses kind of randomly. In this case, it's clear exactly what you have to do and how much you're going to get. Rewards and recognition is also very important, and then equity ownership in some cases via an ESOP, a co-op, or stock options. And then the other thing in this bucket is mini-games, which are short 9 to 12-week challenges to go after some specific aspect of the business that you need to improve. And I'll give you some examples in a few moments. So this is a cute little slide, but it shows that you don't want to drive your car looking backwards. And likewise, the most powerful way to run a business is looking forwards. We often study our last quarter's financials, and we can learn a lot from doing that. But it's even more powerful and even more engaging to be looking forward, to be managing something day to day and week to week and figuring out how you're going to end the month so that you can change course and you can adjust things if you need to. So with that fuel example, every week during the huddle, that hourly worker forecasts how we're going to end the month in terms of fuel. And he might think this, week 1, we're going to spend $5,000 on fuel. In week 2, I have found that the cost of fuel has gone up. So I now forecast we're going to end January by spending $6,000 on fuel. So if you know this in real time, we can spend less on something else so that we protect our profitability. And the really great thing about this is it's not management saying spend less on fuel. It's somebody owning that line and figuring out how to do it. So that agency is there in a way that it's normally not. So why do we talk about a game? Because in any game, there are key things. There's a goal, there's rules, there's a scoreboard, and a reward. And it's the same in business. People learn better when they're engaged and when they're having fun. We love to harness people's competitive instincts. But we're very, very clear that in this ownership culture that we're competing against the numbers. We're not competing against each other. We're always working together as a team, holding each other accountable and competing against those numbers. People love having a chance to win. It increases your morale. As Andrea said, you're treating people like grown-ups, giving them agency and letting them find these opportunities to win. Understanding the business and actively participating in it helps people have job security. It helps the business harness the wisdom of the group, and then it gives you lots and lots of chances to teach yourselves and each other about the business. And I've seen management teams that start doing open book management and learn new things about their business. So there's opportunities for learning at every level. So here's an example of a scoreboard. Again, you can have a scoreboard that looks like a P&L statement, or you can have these very colorful ones where you can always see exactly where you stand. So at SRC, which is the company that came up with open book management. This was a Tetris game that they played on the wall, and each block represented an additional $1,000 in profit before tax. And if they were able to build the whole wall, that meant they had met their $200,000 in profit before tax. And they did win. And each week they would paint in a new block. We're always talking about people support what they help create. That's a big mantra in open book management. And that's key. You know, we're not imposing this from the top. We're in every aspect of open book getting everybody engaged in creating the game and figuring out what is motivational and having people create it so it's not imposed from the top. Misconceptions about open book. So there's a difference between just sharing last quarter's financials, which is open book reporting, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you lose a lot of opportunities to engage people and get them to learn. So open book management is not just showing last month's financials. It's engaging people in this month's financials. It does not involve sharing salaries. That's always a big stumbling block for people. We share salaries in aggregate, not individual salaries in most cases. And I've never seen a case where competitors got their hands on key data and ruined the company. So just to tell you a little bit of the story of SRC. So this was back in the early 80s, and Jack Stack worked for International Harvester. And he was sent to Springfield, Missouri to sell off a failing division of International Harvester. But he fell in love with this group of people, and he really wanted to save these jobs for these people. So the 13 managers passed around a hat, and they were able to come up with $100,000 on a $9 million selling price. So there was this debt-to-equity ratio of 89 to 1, which, as you know, is not good, along with an 18% interest rate. And the fellow who made the loan actually was fired the next day because it was really a risky loan. And Jack at that point had not even gone to college yet. And he knew that if he could understand these financial statements, everybody could understand them. So he brought people along. Their first critical number was that debt payment. They could not miss one debt payment or that business would be sunk. And he wanted everyone thinking like owners. He didn't want people coming to him and saying, hey, can I get married next month? Is the company stable? He didn't want that on his shoulders. He wanted everybody to have agency and to think like an owner. So this was their first critical number. Everybody understood what the key drivers were. They were checking in constantly, and they managed to make those debt payments and save the company. And, you know, they were at $16 million in sales, 116 employees, one business unit. They are now 100% ESOP, over $500 million in sales, 1,400 employees. They've spun off at least 13 business units, and their share price is very strong. There are original employee owners who are millionaires who have retired with very nice wealth building. The combination of the ESOP and the open book it has been excellent for wealth building. And there's even one guy Jack likes to talk about who was terrible with his personal finances, but he got really good at it through playing open book management at work, and now he advises other people on their finances. So because this was such a successful system, people were constantly coming to SRC in Springfield, Missouri, and asking for a tour and wanting to understand how it worked. So SRC spun off a consulting arm called The Great Game of Business, and there are now businesses in all sorts of industries, some of which you're definitely familiar with, that are practicing open book management.
And for those of you that are not seeing the slides and are calling in from the phone, this includes New Belgium Brewing, Southwest Airline, 1-800-GO-JUNK, Harley Davidson, no idea, and Zingerman and a few other companies.
Yeah, and they're not all represented there. So just to give you a few examples, a lot of these companies that do open book management, some start with employee ownership and then realize now that we're employee owned, we really need to educate everyone so that they're thinking like owners. Others start with open book management, get everyone thinking like owners, and then they decide that employee ownership is a good next step. So I've seen both ways. But either way, companies that practice open book management tend to have higher wages, more wealth building capacity, career ladders, obviously a lot more voice for people. So King Arthur Flower.
And Claire, sorry if I can start jumping in here. Is that data well compiled? Is it something that is available, the business case for open book management or the comparative results?
There's a very strong business case for employee ownership. And then I believe Tom mentioned that a lot of these mention participatory management as well. And then I have a lot of anecdotal evidence from companies that I've profiled and worked with. I don't know, I can look for more data on open book management.
Or it could be an interesting research project for somebody to take on, to actually parse out or carve the value that one can attribute to open book management versus employee ownership or other practices. Okay.
I'll add that the Great Game itself has a pretty good library of short business cases about open book management. There have been some conversations, some of which I've been involved with, to try to get a more rigorous outside evaluation of open book through their model and other models. There's been very little research in that extent. We do have one paper that we'll share at the end of this presentation that looked at open book from an external evaluator wrote about open book implementation in a restaurant in Boston, and the results were pretty impressive.
Great.
I think that research would be really helpful because a lot of the big ESOP intermediaries like Menke and others really don't stress employee participation as a benefit of employee ownership. And I think the more we can get data to build the case that employee participation adds profitability to the business and is not just a kind of cultural preference in an employee-owned company, I think that will be advantageous to promoting more democratic ESOPs, governance structures. So.
Yes, agreed. And I've also been working with the Evergreen cooperatives to implement open book management because it goes very, very well with existing employee-owned businesses. So just to tell you a couple of stories about companies. King Arthur Flour is actually the oldest flour company in the U.S., and it was owned for 5 generations by one family. And then in the mid-1990s, the next generation wasn't interested in running the company, and they had begun practicing open book management in the 80s. So after a lot of careful study, they decided to sell the company to the employees via an ESOP, which went very well with their engaged culture through open book management, and they sold it in stages. But they showed great financial improvement. They went from 20 employees and $8 million in sales in the 90s to 325 employees and $120 million in sales today. And they're a B corporation, regularly win Best Places to Work awards. That's one metric we look at. And between open book management and the ESOP, again, a lot of their hourly employees have been able to build wealth and get into a better financial situation. Zingermans is one you may have heard of. That is a group of food-related businesses in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They both practice and teach open book management, and they've got this fantastic customer service culture, very clear framework for how business is done, and an ability to empower employees to make good decisions within that framework. And they have some great examples of engagement through open book management. So at their Roadhouse restaurant, their food costs were very, very high, and they were trying to figure out what to do. And a dishwasher mentioned that he was throwing away a lot of French fries because they gave big portions. So he suggested that they give smaller portions but give free refills. And I think they did something similar with sugar cubes. Instead of having a bowl of open sugar cubes, they gave the packages so that they didn't have to throw them all away each time. Another one is New Belgium, which you've probably familiar with. They're an employee-owned brewery based in Fort Collins, Colorado. They're employee-owned 100% via an ESOP, and they practice open book management. They have a fantastic culture with a lot of opportunities for communication and participation, and they find all kinds of ways to reduce waste and increase quality, and people know that those savings will be shared with them through their bonus plan. And I promised you an example of a mini game. So here's one I saw when I visited New Belgium's Asheville, North Carolina plant recently. So they have a liquid center, which is their bar, and they realized they could sell quite a bit more through that bar if they just implemented some practices around just mentioning to someone, you've had a number of these fat tires, would you like to take home a case? You know, so they had a bunch of practices that they wanted to do to sell more. And the prize that the employees playing the game came up with was they wanted to go to this music venue called the Orange Peel. So the scoreboard is a giant vinyl record, and then it was covered with slices of orange peel. And each slice represented $4,700 in additional sales. And so each time they made another $4,700, they took off a slice. And when all the slices were gone, they got to go to their venue. And so they could see at any moment how they stood with their game, and they were changing behaviors. And this was about a 12-week mini game. I saw another mini game there around pallets. There was an hourly worker who said, it doesn't make any sense to pay this outside company to sort our pallets and give us back the good ones. Why don't we just keep the good ones and give them the bad ones? So they were playing a mini game around pallets.
So one thing that had never been clear to me before we started talking on open book management was the actual co-design of the game by the workers themselves, right? There's not a set of games that is predetermined, but they themselves play a role in this. And then we'll go back to this at the end of the presentation, but I do want to be mindful, since it has come up in prior webinars, the idea of what that allocation of the value that is being created is to the workers versus to owners or to management in terms of their own compensation, right? If each of those slices is, what do you say, $4,700 in extra sales, right? That's a good chunk of change in terms of which percentage should go to one or the other. But we'll loop back to that at the end of this. Thanks, Anne Claire.
Sure. And then Tasty Catering is the company I mentioned before, catering company out of Chicago. They were run very top-down by three brothers, and one day the younger generation came to the president and said, you have to change or we're leaving. And we need a better culture. We need a participatory culture. So they bought everybody a copy of Good to Great, and they went through this process of defining their core values as a company, which are prominently displayed on the wall in English and Spanish, and they read them prior to every meeting, sort of like AA, so that people remember them and refer to them by number. And they practice open book management. They at first failed with open book because they tried to implement it from a top-down perspective, and they had management running their huddles. And when they went back and thought about it and got some more training, they put their chef in charge of the weekly huddles, and it was a lot better. And they do very well. They have now a completely different culture. They're a good example of a company that can change their culture midstream. Back to you, Tom.
So I'm going to talk next about impact investing and open book management. And will they acknowledge that there really has not been a lot of research done in this field? I'm greatly hopeful that there will be more in the coming decade. And the acknowledgement there's only a few investing companies, even impact investors, that use open book management in any kind of way so far. But we can look at what they're doing to some extent, but I also want to try to lay out a bit of a theoretical case of how impact investing could work using open book as a lens. And to do that, I'm going to go back first to this image of the agency problem in business. Because one of the things that I find so useful about this image is that it teaches you that the relationship between ownership and management in a company is largely defined by how information flows between them. That the tensions between ownership and management, and ultimately the tensions between management and workers, a lot of that has to do with data. And that the flow of data is ultimately going to be determinative of how management either empowers or disempowers both workers and owners, even in an employee ownership setting. So to explain what I'm talking about a little bit more, I'd like to draw on the metaphor of an operating system. An OS in the the world of business can be thought of as a way of thinking about how does information flow through a company? How does it get to where it needs to go so that people can make good decisions? And it may be useful to think about this from a management perspective in terms of separating operating systems from apps. So an app might be something like the Toyota production system or total quality management or Six Sigma, all of these management disciplines that can have really good effects, but they only affect one area of information in a company, right? So like with the Toyota production system, it's all about how is quality communicated up from the front lines in the company to management. And it's very good for doing that. You can do that in different contexts with very different kinds of companies, but that's its sole focus. When I talk about an operating system, it's really more how does the company's entire operating model support the flow of management to different stakeholders in that company. That's what an operating system is. So the most common operating system by far in the world is what we call command and control, right? So, I mean, instinctively, we all know what this is. Command and control companies are companies where what the boss says is final. My word is law. And it's a very hierarchical system, a very tribal system. But it's one that's been given a lot of credibility and kind of sophistication, particularly by business schools over the years. And perhaps no one is more responsible for that than Frederick Winslow Taylor, the somewhat famous efficiency expert who popularized the idea of management science in the late 19th, early 20th century. Taylor doesn't get talked about much in business schools anymore because they're a little embarrassed of him. He was kind of a fraud and a con artist, but he was greatly influential in changing the perception of management as a discipline and for creating the idea that management could be scientific and that there could be a way of systematizing things. And this quote tells you all you need to know about his attitude towards workers, which is that he thinks that they were ultimately the enemies of efficiency. And he turned a lot of his attention towards how to force workers to do more in less time. But he was also interesting, and I think this is useful in talking about the game metaphor. He was interesting because Taylor was the first really influential manager to advocate paying workers a variable income based off of profits, as well as kind of as wages. And the thing is, the kind of income, the kind of profit sharing he encouraged companies to do was strictly top down, and it was based on ideas about how efficient workers could be in a set amount of time, and it was a pittance. But he still kind of popularized that idea, and he made it into something that got some acceptance in the business world. So I think it may be useful in kind of drawing out the idea of command and control as an operating system to illustrate it. And I've tried to do that on this slide. So if you think how management is supposed to work, and forget about personalities and everything, but just how we idealize a command and control company to work. In the beginning, you have data. You have this fog in the background that to make a decision, you have to make sense of that data includes the company's history and internal operation data, includes market data, and a host of other things. But you need someone to kind of clear that fog and figure out, what are we going to do? And that someone is the brain trust. It's the top upper management of the company who are charged with analyzing and coming up with a strategic plan and a forecast, right? And this is what every single business school student is essentially taught to do during their time there. And the strategic plan illuminates everything. It clears the fog. It says we've got a clear set of actions that we can take, doing things that will help our company perform better. Next slide, please. Once the brain trust has its strategic plan in place, it then disseminates that plan up and down throughout the company in the form of marching orders. And there's a saying we use in open book world, which is that you have to teach the why before the how. This is the opposite. You tell people the how, and you basically never tell them the why. And so people are, they understand they have to do things, but they're never told why. They don't connect it to their own fortunes or to the company's fortunes. There's no transparency there. There's no line of sight. Next slide, please. So a lot of people, even in the mainstream management world, see this model as outdated, as it holds companies back. It's excessively hierarchical. One very influential thinker that both Anne Claire and I have benefited from is Gary Hamel in this regard, who has written about management 2.0. He and identifies case studies about companies that are so lean and agile and highly participatory that they're able to innovate constantly in every quadrant of the company, and that everyone feels like innovation is part of their job, and that they're willing to kind of throw their hearts into it because it's so rewarding and exciting to work in a place like this. This kind of management model is this idea of what management should be feeds into Open Book. Open Book is based on this ideal of management being a more participatory, dynamic process. So to put this, kind of compare it to the command and control model using my metaphor, you still got data that you have to make sense of in an open book environment. And you still do have a brain trust in most cases. There are some open book management companies that are, completely 100% democratic, but there's still the exceptions. Most companies have some kind of hierarchy. For those of us who have worked in co-ops, we know that even when there's no defined hierarchy, there often is an informal one that still kind of determines how the company works. The difference in open book management, though, is the brain trust doesn't put itself at the center of the process. It kind of stands off to the side and says, what we're going to do is we're going to clean up this data, and we're going to make sure that everyone can understand it, and we'll give you the training and resources you need to understand it. But we're going to invite everyone into the process of actually figuring out what it is we're going to do. That the forecast we create, whether it's an annual plan or just for next week's work, that's going to be a joint process, and everyone who works in the company has a role to play in that. And the benefit of this, in addition to just kind of creating more business literacy and participation in the company, is that I have these kind of clever thin lines here in the picture, but there are lines of sight so that the company's greater fortune is, and its connection to both the employees' lives, my lives, your lives, and what we do every day is much more clear. So I really kind of make this a little concrete. Before I worked at the Hitachi Foundation, I worked for a retail co-op for many years, and in every department pretty much. And even though it was a co-op, it was a pretty hierarchical place. And I was constantly told, the thing we have to do, if you have nothing to do and you're just kind of lounging around in the stores, you need to front and face the shelves. And no one really said, this is why we front and face the shelves. This will help customers see the product. It'll help, us sell more, and ultimately you will benefit, make more money because the co-op will be more successful. I was just told directly, front and face the shelves again and again. And so that simple action, that everyday thing that employees are expected to do, goes unexplained and becomes a source of resentment. And Open Book ultimately seeks to diffuse that, and over time makes that range for us bigger and bigger and bigger, until really everyone in the company is a part of it. Next slide, please. So another reason to be interested in the operating system, the OS of a company as an investor, is that there's really good literature now about the connection between general company operations and quality jobs. And the most popular book to emerge in that field recently is Dana Pon's The Good Job Strategy, which looks at how retail companies that value operational excellence are actually able to create much better jobs, higher paying jobs that people want to stay in and move up in, rather than the kind of really poor job that we associate with retail most of the time. The key traits in this kind of operating setting is that good job strategy companies operate with slack. They hire more people than management consultants would generally advise that they have. They cross-train everyone to do everything, and that's very much in keeping with open book principles. They also standardize and empower. They create processes that people can follow so that they have more decision-making power on their own. Again, very much an open book principle. And to do that, they also focus and simplify. They really kind of bear down on their core competencies as a company and make sure they're not trying to sell anything extraneous to that. And while Dr. Tom really illuminated how this could work in the service sector, the findings that she finds that there's a long history in the operations literature showing similar things in manufacturing and to healthcare as well. We looked at this a lot when I was at the Hitachi Foundation.
And as some of the folks on the call might be familiar with, the business case and in turn the investor case that Zeynep Town makes in the books is actually pretty solid. The evidence is there. It's not airtight. The one thing that we've been dealing with and we're still wrapping our head around is this. Maybe, the best counter argument to the evidence was, well, in that case, why is it that there are so many profitable companies that have, very close management and very terrible jobs? And we have not managed to come up with a good answer to that. Maybe somebody out there with a good rhetorical flourish can provide it.
My hunch, I don't want to be a Pollyanna about, being an excellent employer is always going to lead to great employer returns, great shareholder returns. But I think companies don't do this because it's hard, because it's not as easy as making money in other ways, and it takes discipline and commitment and things that can be in short supply. And the other thing is that a very hierarchical organization it's our inheritance as humans. We have been doing hierarchy very consistently across all kinds of cultures, throughout our history. And breaking away from that and creating a new model it requires determination and imagination that most people are not ready for.
Yeah, and in a corollary project that we're doing with Tanzi Wellan at the NYU Center for Sustainable Business, we're seeing very much this intersection between jobs, job quality, future of work, and the short-termism piece. So it seems like a lot of this, to your point, Tom, if you're looking at investor returns in a very short term, you're going to go with a bad job strategy or a non-open book management strategy. If you have that commitment to the longer term, then your returns will be better in that case. And that's where the investor's role comes in countering the short-termism across their investments.
It may be that there's not a single organizational culture that leads to success. So, for example, a very extractive company that exploits workers and has high turnover could create a successful model measured in terms of profits, revenues, growth. And a very participatory employee-owned company could also create a successful model. They're just different ways of arriving at that final kind of profit and growth number. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think because one works that we should assume the other one can't work also, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree as well, but I like the data from people like Gary Hamel that make the argument that the global economy is changing so fast that in order to be competitive, you really have to be harnessing the wisdom of the whole group.
So that gets to the investor case in a really helpful way. And I think it's useful to step back and look at, even mainstream investors now are demonstrating interest and experiments with employee ownership and to some degree even participatory management. So I was delighted to hear recently from our colleagues at Great Game that KKR's Industrials Group is experimenting now with multiple efforts at investing in employee ownership in companies. They'll acquire a company and then create some kind of employee ownership plan, not necessarily an ESOP, but some kind of incentive, and they will deliver education to employees to help them learn about the stock price and see that there's basically an alignment of interest. that the employees will benefit if the company does well. And they're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They think that there is a business model to be developed out of this. And I think they actually, KKR actually came down to Great Game in Springfield to learn about the open book management approach as a way to do this. They didn't ultimately choose it as their approach. What they're doing is not nearly as immersive or complete, but it's exciting to see that there's going to be some experiments in this field from ordinary mainstream investors. A more dramatic example of an investor that's using open book management lens is SRC itself. Anne Claire went over their very dramatic growth over the last 30 years. Much of the growth that has come in the last decade or so from SRC has been because they formed a holding company and have been either creating or acquiring all kinds of other companies in that time, and basically dramatically expanding their services and products and business models. Like any holding company, they're interested in primarily identifying companies for acquisition that have strong synergies with what they do. So they started as a company for remanufacturing engines. Pretty much all their other companies do something related to that. But what's fascinating to me about SRC's holding approach, what they call stake in the outcome investment, is that every single company they either give birth to or acquire must be open book and follow the Great Game of business precisely. Great Game itself plays an important role in kind of sourcing companies for acquisition for SRC. And because they have this very established disciplined approach to open book management, they have a lens. They have a very strong, clear approach that has to do with figuring out how to make management more participatory within a company and to get information flowing to all corners of it so that people can use that information for improvement. Next slide, please. A similar example Anne Claire mentioned earlier is Zingermans in Ann Arbor. Zingermans has done, in many ways, the same thing, but their reasoning for it may be more relevant and I think exciting for people in this group. The founders of Zingermans in the mid-1990s were offered an opportunity to duplicate their business. They had this very successful deli, and some private equity folks came to them and said, you know, we'd love to put one of your delis in every college town in the US. And the founders, Ari and Paul, they thought about it a lot and they said no. They valued too much what they felt that their business was and the role that it played specifically in their college town. And they didn't want to try to duplicate it all over the US. So what they did instead is they started forming new companies locally that offered services or products that were complementary to the original deli. And they have, I think, 13 or 14 of those companies now, including a bakehouse and a creamery and a candy manufacturer and a Korean restaurant and an American food restaurant and a bunch of other stuff. But the other fascinating thing is Zingermans also practices open book management religiously. Every single company needs to do it. They do strategic planning with all of their 14 companies doing it together. And every new company that they create, the founders choose a new partner, almost always coming up through the ranks as employees, to be the primary lead on that business. And so they have essentially created an open book strategy towards community development and economic development in their region that has both made a really fabulous company and a real impact in a small town.
So, Tom, you're bearing the lead on so many of the exciting bits here, including this idea of advancement from within and using this kind of distributive approach, starting from one entity to a roster of entities as a way of creating pathways for folks that are probably coming up from fairly base jobs within the original organization, right? You can think of it maybe a little grandiosely as, you know, the way that PayPal just spun out or spawned all these other organizations in the Valley to something that has a community-based approach to opportunities for advancement for workers whose opportunities historically have been fairly limited. I mean, there's a big contribution that this is making.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, and Anne Claire can speak to this perhaps directly because she's worked with Zingermans directly, but they're a company that, I mean, none of these are perfect employers, but they put a premium on, they pay above average wages in addition to the gain sharing that they do. Paul, one of the founders, is a strong advocate for raising the minimum wage in the nation, and you can find many videos of him talking about this and talking about kind of the importance of they don't do quite open hiring, but they prioritize hiring people who've had trouble past sometimes. And SRC in its own way does the same thing. They really try that they're a company that did what they did because they wanted to save jobs and help people thrive in their community.
I'll just add about Zingermans that they really practice what they preach. Their core value is great customer service, and they measure everything against that. So I asked them recently when I was there how they did with conflict management, and they gave me an example. You know, somebody wasn't getting along with someone, and they said, well, I couldn't give excellent customer service unless I worked this out. So they worked it out. They also do intensive management training. At so many companies, you're promoted to manager based on your skills at your job, but you have no management skills and no way to learn them. And they have a 9-month process, classes and peer groups and all sorts of things in order to really develop their managers. So all those things go into a great participatory culture that works. And it like Tom said, it takes a lot of investment, but it really pays off.
Yeah, I mean, these companies are big inspirations to both of us. I think we got into this because we saw what they could do and what business could be when a company operates this way. So what we have here is, again, like the idea of using open book as a lens for investing is in its very earliest stages still, but there is enough out there that we can kind of establish a spectrum of different ways for investors to dive in here. At kind of the light end of the spectrum is something like what KKR is doing, where they're investing in employee ownership and they're adding some financial education elements to try to create at least some alignment, even though they're not changing the operating system of the company in any other way. In the middle, there are a few companies I've learned about that are experimenting more significantly with investing and using open book as a lens. And there may be someone from one of these companies on this call. I'm only learned about them recently. But Evergreen Investors, Tugboat Group, not to be confused with Evergreen Co-op, is an investment firm that puts a priority on investing in companies that they think can last 100 years or more, that are here for life, that the founders and owners are dedicated to keeping that company the way it is and growing its culture. And they see open book as a major tool for accomplishing that end, and one that ultimately can help facilitate conversions, facilitate employee ownership over time. Evolution Capital Partners is an investment company out of New York, focusing on small businesses. They also use open book as a lens. Transparency is one of the 5 pillars that they apply when looking at potential investments, and while they don't require open book practices out of their investees, it's something that they favor and encourage and help case studies about. At least one client of Great Game has been Evolution Capital investee.
Before we move on to the next slide, Tom, sorry for interjecting again, but the nature of this webinars. Comment from me and then a question from Satyajit on the line, and the two are related. So we, our ears definitely perk up every time KKR or TPG or others. For those not familiar on the line, these are kind of the big private equity names that don't necessarily have a reputation for caring about the well-being of the planet or of the employees, or much less communities in general. Whenever there is this beginning interest on their part in something that came from a social perspective, we get doubly suspicious. And as we've been researching this issue of conversions to employee ownership, the first thing that we started looking into was like, well, what has gone bad in the past when there have been conversions to employee ownership that have resulted really in high leverage, the employees being left in the 1980s with an over-indebted shell. And I'm wondering on my end, and would love both you and Claire's comments or anybody else on the line, what should we be looking out for so that KKR doesn't get patted on the back for starting to look into employee ownership and financial education is kind of the broad, in some ways, a little facile question. The piece that comes up from Satyajit's question is a little more nuanced around that level of extraction, right? Ultimately, we are asking workers to do more because there is something that is now motivating them more, whether it's this sense of the reward or some, social engineering or the fact of the game, etc. And Satyajit says, yeah, if we disconnect open book from meaningful employee ownership, even if there is some return or some prize at the end, doesn't that take the workers' attention away from other sources of value in their lives, right? So if we're going for the business case on the one hand, which is what would get KKR into this space, you're asking the workers to provide even more than they were providing before, while there is still this sort of capital consolidation on the part of the true owners. And as Satyajit says, right, the future would then belong, to the owners of the capital and to employees who are obsessed with incremental productivity improvements for companies that are not necessarily making this commitment to the workers themselves. And it goes to the detriment of some of the, softer perhaps pieces of our life around community, family, engagement, spirituality, and the like. I'm really throwing it out there as a straw man. I'm a bit of a workaholic myself, so I'm kind of the last person to talk about that scenario. But I think it's interesting to see the KKR piece, if it's in the absence of meaningful ownership, basing things on the business case for it, that always, again, brings in some scary actors into it. And then this piece about like, okay, nothing is free in life, so more commitment to the work. Does that mean less bandwidth, less energy, less something else for the workers? It's a big compound question for everybody.
Well, let me just tell you a couple of anecdotes about the third part of the question. So if you are running a company with open book management, you are giving people more agency. People are being asked for their thinking, and they're being put in charge of things they weren't in charge of before. So they're being treated more like adults, and it's more fun, it's more interesting. This is a complete anecdote, but Patrick Carpenter from The Great Game began to work with a company in Springfield, and his barber said to him, "Thank you for doing this work, because the wives of these guys that used to be treated so poorly are so much happier now, because the guys are really engaged at work, and they come home and they're happy and they're in a good mood and they have more energy for their families. So thank you for implementing open book management." And then the second piece to that is that companies who do open book begin to see that people are responsible managers of these resources, and then they decide to implement employee ownership and true equity. And of course, these are smaller companies. I'm not talking about huge companies, but these are anecdotes I've seen.
I'll add to that. Unfortunately, we don't have a slide on the open book gain sharing system, but I think that might alleviate, Andrea, at least some of the concerns that you expressed in Satyajit's question. Because I think part of the beauty of open book, and in particular the way it approaches profit sharing, gain sharing, is the transparency of the process. So even kind of the most forward-thinking progressive businesses that kind of do general profit sharing, they might share profits, 3 or 4 times a year, every quarter, but they don't have a really disciplined approach to kind of expressing what is in the interests of ownership and upper management in this sharing process, and what is in the interest of workers, and how do we negotiate a fair deal. And the open book approach is to try to negotiate a transparent and fair deal around how profits are used in the company. And the way that the form it usually takes is, as we said, targets are set out by the company in a process that, as the company gets better at open book over the years, it becomes more and more participatory. And that target, let's say in a made-up retail company, might be, 1 year we're going to look for a 4% profit, and that's where we want that base level of profit because there's a stake that our ownership has put into this company. They've taken out loans, or otherwise taken on risks, and that there needs to be return on that risk. There also needs to be ways to pay for the company's future growth. We're going to reinvest capital in the company, and some percentage of that 4% is going to go into that. But if you, the workers in this company, can help us get 6%, then you're going to get 50% of that extra growth. If you can help us get to 80% or 8%, then you're going to get 75% of that additional growth. And so there are levels worked out in advance that at least make that negotiation transparent, and provide a way for workers to say, this is for me or it's not. Because it's not going to be for everyone. Not just workers, but managers. People do leave sometimes during times of turbulent change, and open book management can be that. So I don't think it's not a solution that necessarily works for everyone, but it's a solution where people who will work for will find that it ultimately turns into a good deal and one that they have a hand in making, importantly. On the KKR question,
sorry, go ahead.
On the KKR question, I agree with you. My inclination is to be cautious and a little suspicious when a big company like that gets into this space. At the same time, I don't think there's an advantage in discouraging it because they can bring a level of attention to things like open book and employee ownership that I would never get otherwise. But I think what we can do is we can look at the kind of attention they're getting and say, if you in the business media are paying so much attention to what KKR is doing here, why don't you look at what Evergreen is doing there, or SRC is doing here? There are stories out there that need to be appreciated, and it's just so easy for attention to go to the biggest players all the time, positive and negative.
Right, and on that, I think that's precisely, in a sense, the crux of the issue, right? Whenever something starts taking up, whether it's microfinance or employee ownership at scale or OBM in this case, my mind perhaps always first goes, oh God, what could go wrong, and how is somebody going to try to co-opt this? And I think that the asset owners can play a particularly relevant role there in holding those intermediaries accountable as well, right? Saying to KKR, assuming that they are in KKR or TPG, if they are in TPG Rise, whatever else it might be, yes, but that's not what open book management means, or that's not what employee ownership means, making sure that we put some boundaries and some buckets as part of the responsibility as investors that you have to take in this, so that it does not, something that started out being spectacularly useful and worthwhile for the workers doesn't end up being negative. And time for a second to the progressive sharing of the extra profits. Again, folks that have been on the calls for a while might remember some of the discussions around progressive equity that I think Buffer and IndyVC had talked about, this idea that you have a certain level of return that you cap so that the investor or top management is not inclined, the owners or the outside investors are not incentivized to just pursue the highest possible valuation, highest possible exit at the margin, because whatever goes above a certain amount will be shared with other stakeholders, right, as part of the return. So if you sell your company for over X amount, there will be a progressive pool of that gets that gets allocated to the workers, to a community, or some other piece. It's less than 100%, so you still have an incentive at the margin to perform better as a company, but you're not 100% driven just by that part. All right, that was it.
Awesome. Well, I know we only have 10 minutes left, so Anne Claire, do you want to take the last mile?
Sure. So we, with the disclaimer that Tom and I are both affiliated with the Great Game of Business, these are some ways that you can get started. An enterprise could get started, or an investor could learn more about it. So there's a very fun book, The Great Game of Business, that explains and tells the story of how Great Game was invented at SRC and how it's played there. There's also an audio book version. There are several free GGOB webinars on YouTube that you could listen to, 15-minute webinars. You can watch videos of live huddles and see how this really works in real time with real companies. GGOB has an e-learning portal. There's workshops at both GGOB and Zingermans. And some companies just start with a minigame targeted at a specific issue. That's a good first step. And then coaches like us do a deeper dive with companies. We go in, we train an internal multi-departmental design team to become those internal open book management coaches. And we do extensive financial education. We establish those meeting rhythms, teach forward forecasting, create the scoreboards, do mini games, and then launch with the whole company. And just wanted to mention that open book management is very common with for-profit enterprises, but there's also some nonprofits like the Big Brothers and Big Sisters of the Ozark that have had great success with it. And even a government organization, the Greene County, Missouri, they didn't have a tax increase for many, many years, and they were able to increase their performance through open book management. And then I'm working with the Evergreen Cooperatives out of Cleveland, which are for-profit businesses that are owned by low-income workers in neighborhoods in Cleveland. And we're doing open book management there to really make sure people understand the key metrics of the business and have a really strong co-op ownership culture. These are the books. And then there's plenty of books that are not related to Great Game of Business. So some of you may be familiar with Small Giants, that tells the story of Zingermans. There's several open book management books that are not Great Game books. Zingermans books around building a great business. Books like Financial Intelligence around understanding the financials. And then we've talked a little bit about Gary Hamel from the London School of Economics and some of his thinking around why participatory management is so key to the future of business. And then there's a number of articles that hopefully Transform Finance can send out afterwards. Several around SRC and what they've done. National Cooperative Grocers Association has one on open book management and food co-ops. And I worked with the Hitachi Foundation on a series of business action guides, very short, to the point guides on how to do open book at companies, as well as other employee ownership practices.
On that note, Anne Claire and Tom, is it okay if we share the slides with the group? A few folks have been asking for them, so they can just see the links directly there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep,
great.
Definitely.
And then there's workshops coming up that you can see on this slide, the Great Game of Business e-learning. And then Tom wanted me to be sure and mention the Human Capital Advantage curriculum, which I worked with Renata at the Hitachi Foundation to create. And this is targeted for startups, especially in the US, around creating a very engaged culture. And there is a unit on open book management there. And then that's been adapted by Plus Acumen for an international social enterprise audience with some success so far. I think there's a course coming up shortly, and the link is here.
If I could add a quick word, Anne Claire, about, in particular, the Great Game of Social Sectors.
Yes.
That is a new offering that was developed by our colleague, Katie Davis, who was previously the executive director of that Boys and Girls Club, the Ozark. And it's an experiment by Great Game really looking at how this model could spread within the nonprofit and public sector world. It is because it's being directed towards those kinds of organizations, it's lower price than a lot of their other offerings. But I'm particularly excited about it because I think nonprofits not only could benefit a lot from this kind of approach, but in some ways they have a lower barrier to entry, because for-profit companies, one of the big areas where they become reluctant is the original owners don't want to share their finances. The finances are often tied up, sometimes uncomfortably, with their personal finances. And just taking that first step is very hard for many people. You don't have that in the nonprofit world in the same way. I mean, there can be messes behind the finances for sure, but it doesn't have that same kind of vulnerability. And nonprofits are required by law to make their finances public. And so that initial hump can be, it's just less of a factor in the social sector world, and I think it's an exciting thing. I'd like to see more folks try. That's
Great.
Great. Are there any, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, to Tom's point, there are a number of companies practicing open book management that are now in the hands of the second generation. And so we hear many stories of, my dad or mom would never have done this, but I'm ready to share the finances with our employees.
And someone is asking if you could go back to the slide with the, oh, there it is. Great. Slide with the contacts. If you are on the phone and you can't see this, I'm not going to read out and spell out emails, but feel free to reach out to me or to anybody at Transform Finance, and we'll share the contacts with you if, assume Anne Claire and Tom are okay with that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. Were there any other questions from the audience? I can unmute you all for a moment. If so, I'm warning you, just in case you have sketchy noises going on in the background. I am unmuting the phones. And feel free to ask away if there is anything. So I just want to thank you both, Anne Claire and Tom, for joining us for this very enlightening discussion. And I wanted to remind everyone of the upcoming webinar on January 23rd, I believe, to discuss open hiring with Greystone, looking at it from both the perspective of the human capital management piece and the criminal justice, how to invest in ameliorations of criminal justice impacts, especially on communities of color, through alternative pathways for returning citizens and for creating employment opportunities there. And that's it. Yeah, no, look forward to having some of the same folks on that call so we can build on this one, because I think there's an interesting overlap between the two. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Anne Claire, and thank you, Tom, for joining us. Great presentation today.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Take
everyone.
care.
Glad to be
Thanks.
here.
Bye-bye.